I want to next call on Ms. Baldwin, but I do want to make an announcement. We did provide food. We are going to continue to go through the markup. Members and staff may avail themselves of the food. And I do want to announce that we didn't just give the Republicans cucumbers, we gave them bologna and salami and some ham.
It really is. It really is all vegetarian.
That'll be corrected. Ms. Baldwin, you seek recognition for the purpose of offering an amendment. Is that correct?
That's correct. I have an amendment at the desk to Title I.
Mr. Chairman, to Title I.
Point of order.
That would be Baldwin 48.
And has the amendment been submitted in a timely manner?
Yes, it has, Mr. Chairman.
Ladies, recognized.
I'd like to reserve a point of order.
The gentleman reserved a point of order on the amendment. Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Ms. Baldwin of Wisconsin.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The gentlelady is recognized to speak to her amendment for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Department of Energy currently administers 2 distinct technical assistance programs that serve complementary needs. Industrial assessment centers provide assessment services to small and medium-sized manufacturing facilities, while the Combined Heat and Power Clean Energy Application Centers provide assistance and education on the implementation of combined heat and power systems in building and industry. The amendment that I am offering consolidates these DOE-administered university-based centers so that they can, and also organizes them into a nationally consistent network so they can better provide education and outreach to professionals as a way to encourage deployment of existing clean energy technologies. Further, this amendment creates a building center component for a fully integrated approach to better utilizing energy efficiency opportunities. Individually, the industrial assessment centers and the clean energy application centers have proven to be very successful and efficient uses of federal funds. But by coordinating these programs, we can best leverage the strength that they already boast. These strengths include unique understandings of regional energy efficiency needs, strong relationships with local stakeholders, researchers, and thought leaders in the area of energy efficiency, and access to individual region-specific networks of other buildings, businesses, and entities that firms look to regularly for energy-related advice. As a complement to the industrial assessment centers and the Clean Energy Application Center programs, this amendment provides for the establishment of building assessment centers to provide these same strengths, for example, training of engineers, architects, and building technicians in energy efficient design and operation for the building sector, promotion of high efficiency building construction techniques and high efficiency materials options, and identification of opportunities for optimizing energy efficiency and environmental performance in existing buildings. The impact of these 3 Department of Energy programs will be enhanced through designation of no more than 10 centers for energy and environmental knowledge and outreach, geographically dispersed nationwide, that will serve as a hub, a place for one-stop shopping where a variety of energy needs can be coordinated, met, and served by region-specific industrial, building, or clean energy assessment centers. In crafting this language, I worked extensively with the Department of Energy and have the full support of the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, and I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and, Mr. Chairman, would yield back my remaining 2 minutes.
Well, would you yield to me?
I would
have some
be
time
happy
left,
to yield to the Chairman.
because the Department of Energy supports expertise in regional centers called industrial assessment centers and clean energy application centers. They provide valuable services at very low cost to industry and others in helping them adopt new efficiency approaches, clean energy technologies, best practices, reducing costs and preserving jobs. And I want to commend you for this amendment. I think it's a good one, and I urge our colleagues to support it. Yield back the balance. Do you yield back?
I yield back the balance of my time.
Chairman,
Gentleman from Michigan is
recognized.
recognized.
Last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
I'm not so sure that our side is so excited about the amendment. because of the cost. I know that as I have a number of universities in my district, I have one in particular, Western Michigan University, which has been a real leader on energy efficiency for some time. They've made the change with the light bulbs. They've come in with something that we've not done in this building that I wish the speaker would do, and that is to actually put a monitoring device in all of the rooms. They have, I think, at Western Michigan University, they have some 50-some buildings, and in virtually all the rooms, when somebody leaves, the lights go out. The temperature is adjusted, whether it's cooling or heating, based on whatever is more efficient. They've moved to electric vehicles. They have saved hundreds of thousands of dollars of taxpayer money, because it's a public university, in terms of energy conservation, and it's paid for. It will pay for the installation of what they've done. They didn't need to be told how to do it. They didn't need federal money, $50 million a year authorized indefinitely, as I understand in this amendment. They did it. Other universities have come to Kalamazoo, Michigan. They've watched what they've done. They've identified those savings, and it's a laudable goal. But I don't know that we need the money to do this. So we ought to be doing it under existing money, and they ought to be used. They ought to be looking at different college associations and others, so that the taxpayers don't have to actually fund $50 million a year. I don't know how the gentlelady found $50 million a year for this, but we could maybe accept it if you didn't have that $50 million. Why not just?
Would gentlemen?
Yeah, yield to my.
I'd like to ask a
Mr.
question
Barton.
of counsel. I've gone through this just quickly reading it. It looks like it authorizes $85 million a year indefinitely. What's the cost of this? And I realize it's an authorization, not an appropriation. But several places, one place it says $50 million a year. Another place it says $10 million a year.
Would the gentleman yield?
Be happy to.
In total, I think you probably missed one. It was $90 million that is added.
Okay, well, thank you for being honest.
And then, just so you know, the existing centers that this amendment also touches,
They get $30 million.
The CEACs are authorized right now from 2008 fiscal year to 2012 at $10 million per year.
You changed
the
that to
ACES,
30.
the Industrial Assessment Centers, which have an indexed appropriation that were both of these were incorporated in the Energy Independence and Security Act, which is when we last sort of looked at the level of funding. But they're, not specifically to your question, but these are things that pay for themselves because of the efficiency that's deployed through these programs. And I would be very much surprised, Mr. Upton, if the universities in your district didn't seek counsel from their regional assessment center, which is in your area at the University of Michigan, I believe the Ann Arbor campus.
Yeah, I actually know that University of Michigan was so impressed with what Western Michigan University did. And again, Western Michigan University is in Kalamazoo. University, the big house, that's in Ann Arbor. University of Michigan was so impressed with what Western Michigan did, they actually sent a team to see what they did. They didn't. I don't know whether they actually needed one of these centers. They actually looked to see what Western did, and they did great things. They didn't, I don't think, actually utilize this center in terms of the progress that they made.
Well, if we accept with what's authorized plus what the change, is the total authorization per year $110 million?
Can you repeat the question?
I said, with what you're authorizing that's new, plus the change in the authorization of existing programs, is the total authorization of this amendment $110 million per year?
No, 90 is my
90
count.
per year.
I defer to counsel, make sure that my math is correct, but that's... it's 50 for the new building assessment centers, $5 million per year for the federal share of some of the training internship opportunities to get more people with expertise in efficiency. It is an increase for the clean energy application centers from an authorized level of 10 million to an authorized level of 30.
So that's plus 20. No, I want to cut it by about a factor of 10. I mean, it's an authorization, not an appropriation.
Would the gentleman yield?
Well, it's not. I'll speak. I'll be happy to yield Mr. Upton's time.
Be glad to yield the gentleman.
Without objection, Mr. Upton will have an additional minute so that Mr. Barton can yield to you.
Oh, I'm be happy to yield the gentlelady from Wisconsin.
I know that there was discussion on previous amendments about how we come up with these numbers, but this was in consultation with the ACEE and also Department of Energy folks who were consulted in the crafting of this amendment, and that's their belief is what it will take to get this greater coordination and greater impact of these programs.
Gentleman yields back his time. Further discussion?
Mr. Chairman.
Democratic side, and Mr. Stearns on the Republican side.
The last word. I think most of us have not really read this, so I'm just going to ask you a few questions. Of the money that goes, how much goes to the university itself as opposed to funding interns and energy, Secretary of Energy Department employees? In other words, of this money, how much is going to government administration, how much is actually going to be given to the university?
I believe that all of this passes through to these university-based new building assessment centers. Of that allocation, of the $5 million for the internships, that would be passed through ultimately to, with matching dollars, by the way, to the people engaged in those internships.
You say there's 10 regional centers. They all have to be set up with employees, right? Or are they existing? All of these things are called centers, so I want to make sure we're understanding. The new centers that are authorized in this amendment are not in existence now. They can, DOE can designate up to or no more than 10 centers for energy and environmental knowledge and outreach. They would be dispersed geographically nationwide and are intended to coordinate the activities of the 3 centers within them, the Industrial Assessment Center, the Clean Energy Application Centers, and the new Building Assessment Centers. Will the money be going to private institutions or state institutions? How will the Secretary of Energy make that decision? Who will make the decisions which universities get what? How would a university seek to get part of this roughly $100 million?
There's a number of criteria that are laid out in the bill. These new centers that are being created have to be based on the existence of either an industrial assessment center or a clean energy application center already at that institution, or one of the new building assessment centers at that institution. And then they, again, have to be geographically distributed throughout the country. And there's a number of other criteria listed in the bill, but it is the Department of Energy that would make those assessments. They would competitively bid.
So a university would have to set up an industrial center before they could actually bid?
The industrial assessment centers already exist.
At all the universities?
No, there are, for industrial, let me just tell you how many there are.
Well, I mean, just
those are, I think,
general.
8 of them nationally. Oh, sorry,
Yeah,
26 of them university-based.
The criteria would be they'd set up an industrial center at a university. Both a private and a state university could get money. For example, a private university in Washington, D.C. could get some money as well as a state university, and there's no difference in the criteria. Either one could get the same amount of money depending upon their need. How would a university determine whether one university gets 5 or 10 million? Because it seems like $100 million is a lot of money, but when you spread that across 50 states with all the universities, privates, it's you know,
Will the gentleman yield?
Sure.
I don't think every university will get this. There's a certain number of universities that are already involved in this, and this would bring a new building assessment center with the existing industrial assessment centers, clean energy application centers, all under a group of 10 new regional centers for energy and environmental knowledge and outreach based at major universities.
Well,
but not all of them will have it.
Okay, so you're...
This isn't pork. This is for everybody to have one. It's for accomplishing some goals.
So what you're saying is the university will not get money unless they establish this industrial center. That's a prerequisite.
I believe that's
correct. Then university, after that does that on their own dime, then they could apply for the grant, and they would get it, and the Secretary of Energy would make the decision whether they get the money and how much. What's this typical profile of a grant? In other words, let's say a state university applies, it has industrial center. How much do you think is there a limit to how much one would get, or is this spread over evenly?
The premise of your question wasn't quite correct.
Okay.
So, for example, industrial assessment centers, the University of Florida has one, for example. Those have been authorized for many, many years. We adjusted the authorization level in the Energy Efficiency and Security Act. That program in this fiscal year is nationwide authorized at $190 million.
I'm just going to finish here.
So if it say the University of Florida wanted then to become one of these new centers, they would apply. It would be a competitive in a competitive nature, and the idea is there'll be up to 10 geographically dispersed throughout the country.
I would just conclude by saying you could make the argument, convince our side, if you could actually show by spending this money, you would recapture and save money in every university in a period of 5, 6, 7 years, it would pay for itself. Have you done a study on that, or is any analysis of that?
I know that the intent of the existing centers is to have cost-effective energy efficiency strategies deployed and get that, as well as training the next generation of engineers and architects, et cetera, who are going to be able to help us achieve these goals. But I do not have anything specific in terms of the number of years that this could be paid for by the deployment of these technologies.
Gentleman's time has expired. Who seeks recognition? Mr. Barton.
I want to ask some questions of the council. The Waxman substitute manager's amendment has a complete title too, called Energy Efficiency, Building Energy Efficiency Programs. Isn't the Section 172 and 173 of the Baldwin Amendment rendered superfluous if we adopt Title II as it is? Doesn't Title II set up a federally mandated energy efficiency building code program?
The centers that the Baldwin Amendment refers to are based at universities but provide expertise that is offered through outreach to the entire community as to how, for example, in the industrial assessment centers, industry can use best practices to achieve energy efficiency. And the new building centers, builders can adopt new materials and new practices to achieve energy efficiency. Building codes are a minimum legal standard to which a building must be met.
But these are federal mandates. Doesn't that override what Ms. Baldwin is attempting to do?
No, it would not, because the building codes that would be part of the federal mandate would rely on the kind of expertise that these centers would develop in terms of how to make buildings that are much more efficient.
Okay. Well, thank you. I want to make a few comments, and then I'll be happy.
You're still on your own time.
Yes, I think. I'm at a loss here, Mr. Chairman. We have a program. There's nothing wrong with what Ms. Baldwin's attempting to do here, except that it's going to cost approximately $100 million a year, if it's fully funded. Now, we just rejected the Blunt amendment to try to put a price cap on residential electricity rates. Again, this is an authorization. It's not an appropriation. But $95 million a year is real money. And once you set these centers up, they're going to develop their own constituencies. They're going to be very adept at lobbying the Congress for funding. I mean, I would think that you might want to I'm not sure we want to do either one, but I don't think you do mandated building codes and then do this also. This is way too expensive as it's currently structured. So I would strongly oppose the amendment. I might also point out that she's actually given us two amendments, because she creates a new Section 172 and a Section 173, which normally that would be two amendments instead of one. So I think there's a little bit of a problem.
Will the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield to Mr. Whitfield.
Thank you for yielding. Obviously, this is a laudable goal, and I happen to serve on the board of governors of a university, and every university in the country right now, their endowments have gone down. They've lost a significant amount of money in their endowments. They're having to reduce programs, funding for programs. Some of them have even had to dismiss some professors, like the University of Florida, for example. And all of them want additional money from the federal government for their existing programs. And the question I would have about this is the reality of the appropriators actually appropriating $100 million for a new program to help assess environmentally friendly building codes or whatever, when the real job of a university is to educate students, and certainly this would be one way to educate students, but it just seems to me, while it's laudable, there's nothing wrong with this program, the reality is that the funding is just not going to be available. I
yield back, Mr. Chairman. I oppose the amendment.
Further discussion of the amendment, Ms. Blackburn?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Baldwin said she had a list of the universities that had existing centers. I would like to yield to her for the purpose of her reading that list of universities.
I'd be pleased to do that. The industrial assessment centers are located at 26 universities: the University of Alabama, Bradley University, Colorado State University, University of Dayton, University of Delaware, University of Florida, Georgia Institute of Technology, University of Illinois Chicago, Iowa State University, Lehigh University, University of Louisiana at Lafayette, University of Massachusetts, University of Michigan, University of Missouri, University of Miami, Mississippi State University, North Carolina State University, Oklahoma State University, Oregon State University, San Diego State University, San Francisco State University, Syracuse University, Tennessee Technological University, Texas A&M University, University of Washington, and West Virginia University. Sadly, not University of Wisconsin, but anyways. With regard to the clean energy application centers, there are 8. 6 of those are, from what I can tell, are university-based. University of Maryland, University of Illinois Chicago, University of Massachusetts Amherst, Washington State University, University of California Berkeley, and Mississippi State University.
I thank the gentlelady for the clarification. I will add to what the ranking member was just discussing when he said there was duplication in Title II in the provisions that talk about the building codes and how those would be set. Well, I would add that another redundancy with this amendment is in this Mr. Dingell's amendment today, which is subtitle J, dealing with nuclear and advanced technologies. We placed a provision, there's a provision in there that is the Clean Energy Deployment Administration under the direction of the administrator of the administration and the board of directors. So what we have is a third already. Look at what we are doing. You've got 3 entities that are going to be involved with delivering what appears at first glance to be the same type service and have the same expectations, and you're going to have this money, hundreds of millions of dollars that are going to go into something that we have already covered in Title II and also previously in Subtitle J earlier today. And with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back her time. Any, yes, Mr. Gingrey.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word. In regard to this, again, I'm looking at Title II in regard to energy and efficiency, and it says Department of Energy would provide funding to states to implement these requirements in regard to both commercial and residential buildings to improve energy efficiency. And as I look at the gentlelady's amendments, I mean, it's already been mentioned, but another $100 million a year, to me, it just seems like that money is no issue. Money is no issue. I mean, I'm not really questioning the worthiness of the amendment and Ms. Baldwin's thoughts behind this, but it seems to me that we're already doing it, and it's just duplicative. And why would we just nonchalantly amend this bill so that we could spend another $100 million a year? For that reason, I'm opposed to it, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Are we ready for the vote? The vote now comes on the Baldwin amendment. All those in favor of the amendment will say aye. Aye. Opposed, no.
No. Roll call, Mr. Chairman.
The ayes appear to have it. The gentleman requests a roll call, and the clerk will call the roll. And yes, thank you very much. The point of order has been withdrawn.
Mr. Waxman.
Aye.
Mr. Waxman, aye. Mr. Dingle.
You're for it?
Mr. Markey. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Rush. Ms. Eshue. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette, aye. Mrs. Capps. Mr. Doyle. Ms. Harmon. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky, aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, aye. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee, aye. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner, aye. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, aye. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Melanson, aye. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow, aye. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, aye. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen, aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor, aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes, aye. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Space. Mr. Space, aye. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney, aye. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton, aye. Mr. Braley?
Aye.
Mr. Braley, aye. Mr. Welch? Mr. Barton? Mr. Barton? Mr. Barton, no. Mr. Hall? Mr. Hall, no. Mr. Upton? Mr. Upton, no. Mr. Stearns? Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Deal? Mr. Deal, no. Mr. Whitfield? Mr. Whitfield, no. Mr. Shimkus? Mr. Shimkus, no. Mr. Shattuck? Mr. Shattuck, no. Mr. Blunt? Mr. Boyer? Mr. Boyer, no. Mr. Radonovich? Mr. Radonovich, no. Mr. Pitts? Mr. Pitts, no. Ms. Bono Mack? Ms. Bono Mack, no. Mr. Walden? Mr. Walden, no. Mr. Terry? Mr. Terry, no. Mr. Rogers? Mrs. Myrick? Mrs. Myrick, no. Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania? Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania, no. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, no. Ms. Blackburn? Ms. Blackburn, no. Mr. Gingrey? Mr. Gingrey, no. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Scalise, no. Mr. Dingle? Mr. Dingle votes aye. Mr. Markey? Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Boucher? Mr. Pallone? There? I'm sorry. Mrs. Capps? Mrs. Capps, aye. Mr. Stupak? Mr. Stupak, aye. Mr. Matheson? Mr. Matheson, aye. Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle, aye. Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch, aye. Mr. Rush? Mr. Rush, aye. Mr. Green, I'm sorry. Mr. Green, aye. Mr. Ross? Aye. Mr. Ross votes aye.
Have all members responded to the roll? Any member wishes to change his or her vote? If not, we'll tally the vote.
I can't believe I did this. Okay, so what, did you agree with Kayla?
That's what I understand.
did get
30?
I understand that the caterers brought all
the good stuff to your side.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
on that vote, the yeas were 30 and the nays were 19.
30 ayes, 19 noes. The amendment's agreed to.